don't accuse me of not understanding Calvinism when I'm quoting from the leading sources and citing them and showing you this is what they're teaching.
I brought your podcast up to, and this has happened to me a couple of times. Thanks a lot. And what I'm getting to is I'll say, well, yeah, you need to go to Soteriology 101. You need to look at the articles written by. Yeah, no. He doesn't get it. Okay. Uh,
That's probably one of
but
the number one critiques that I'll get from Calvinists that have heard of me secondhand, maybe through James White or some other theological opponent, if you will.
yeah,
And he just doesn't get it. Um,
yes,
yeah, he just doesn't understand. And I understand where they're coming from. Nobody wants to believe that the person who's contending with them, and maybe even doing so successfully, because a lot of people are coming out of Calvinism through this ministry by God's grace, um, that that they just don't want to deal with those issues. And so it's easier just to say, oh, he just doesn't understand Calvinism. He just doesn't get it. And I've sat down with some of these guys. I've had broadcasts with some of these guys, and I'll walk them through and I'll say, let me explain Calvinism from the way I understand it. And they'll walk through and they'll go, yeah, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's right. And so, okay, so I've just explained Calvinism to your approval, but you say I don't understand it. Okay.
right.
Maybe it's not because maybe I'd reject Calvinism because I actually do understand it. And
Yeah,
I'm actually looking at its implications in their full view of the whole counsel of God's word. Maybe it is that the arguments that I read from Tozer and Lewis and other notable Christian heroes of the faith throughout Christian history who've stood against these doctrines, maybe they're actually right. Or maybe God's determined them to be wrong. And why would God determine his own child to misinterpret the Bible? How do we
yeah,
rationally understand
yeah.
that from a
Just goes in a
worldview?
circle. Yeah,
Yeah, it again, there's many claims like that lead to complete irrational conclusions that the Calvinist has to punt to mystery on. And
yes,
I'm fine with
yes.
mystery that the Bible affords, but there are mysteries that are being created by the systematic itself that simply are not afforded by the pages of Scripture.
Exactly. I've made that last point myself to a couple of those I've had discussions with. And again, it always goes back, well, you just don't really understand it, and
Well, it's the emperor has no clothes. That that
yes,
that's the
yes.
level of that response. Oh, you just can't see it because you're just not wise enough. You're just not smart enough.
Yeah,
If you really understood Calvinism, if you were a real Calvinist, you'd be able to see the emperor's clothes.
yeah,
And that's kind of the level of that argumentation. And again, brothers, I love you, but instead of saying, "Hey, you don't understand," say instead, when you said, Leighton, when you said XYZ, that doesn't represent any form of Calvinism at all, and then make a case. Because
right.
I promise you, I'm probably quoting from John Calvin himself
Yes,
or a notable Calvinist like John Piper or John MacArthur when I'm making a point, and you telling me that doesn't represent the swath of what is called Calvinism, and then don't have anything to support your case, I'm just going to push back on you and say, love you, brother, but maybe it's not your form of Calvinism that I'm critiquing at this moment. Maybe you're a different kind of Calvinist, kind of a buffet Calvinist where you like a little bit of that, a little bit of this, but not the historical, Calvinism as taught by John Calvin or the leading proponents of it. That's fine. Then maybe you should stand with me in opposition to those particular points. But don't accuse me of not understanding Calvinism when I'm quoting from the leading sources and citing them and showing you this is what they're teaching and this is why I disagree with it. And so at least deal with the parts of it that you do agree with if you're going to contend with it.
exactly. And I had that interesting, like when you mentioned MacArthur, and we're not going to get into this, but when we started off in a discussion, a friend of mine about this, and he's in the Calvinistic camp, Reform camp, and we got a little bit into the dispensationalism. I said, well, but MacArthur is pretty much in a dispensational pre-trib position when he's still a Calvinist, as firmly and a leader in that movement. And he's well, no. It was like they threw him under the bus real quick, Like it's interesting to see them once in a while turn on each other. And he's like, well, he doesn't really. It was almost without saying it directly. It was saying, well, he really doesn't understand it fully. I'm saying, no, stop right there. Okay, he knows way more than you and I both do on it put together. So, and I've done a couple of podcasts with it, and I know what some of the responses I'm going to get from I'm saying this, but I've always been bothered because, and I know the response will be, well, who's calling the kettle black here, But I've always had to struggle with some of there's just this certain level of arrogance involved in it, and it's always bothered me. It seemed like I've always run into that. And well, you just don't understand. You don't know. Okay, and when I bring up Leighton Flowers or someone else similarly, as well, and they were Calvinists. Well, they weren't really truly I mean, okay, you keep moving the goalpost here, and it's just very irritating, and you can't really have a good
Well, and it
discussion.
sounds, if you really think about it, when you look back through history, it sounds like Gnosticism. I mean, what is Gnosticism? It's this enlightenment that you're
Levels of
given by
knowledge,
the divine. Yeah,
right?
the divine chooses you and gives you a level of understanding that's just not given to everybody else. And that I know that that's not what they would ever want to call it or associate themselves with. I get it. I wouldn't have wanted to been when I was a Calvinist. I wouldn't have wanted to be associated with that. But looking back on how I treated others and how I thought about this worldview, is very Gnostic in the sense of this having this insight and knowledge into this deep, theological matter that just the common layman just doesn't get. People like my dad, he means well, but he's just not deep. He's just not a deep thinker. He's just not exegetical. That kind of, how dare I
Yeah,
look down at my nose at my father,
yeah,
who
yeah,
had more godliness in his pinky than I had in my life at the time, especially, and just so many others throughout. I think of so many professors I look down my nose at like that as a brat 19, 20, 21 year old. Oh, they mean well. They just don't get it. How dare I have that kind of arrogance to look
hmm
down my nose at other people thinking I'd figured something out, I'd caught something about theology when these people have been studying theology their entire adult lives. And some people, not all Calvinists are that way, by the way, but I
right. I
certainly
know that.
was
Yeah,
when I was a
absolutely.
Calvinist.
Yeah,
And I certainly was when I was in my 20s as a Calvinist. And I know many who treat us like you're describing are probably in that stage in their lives, where they're going to hopefully look back on it and go, ugh, man, and cringe like I do when I look back at myself in my 20s.
yeah, me too. And I wasn't even Calvinist, but I have plenty of things to look back on and go, yeah, I was pretty arrogant back then,
Yeah.
But
Uh,
I'll never forget the experience I had when I was a couple of years ago. I was asked to do a funeral. I was outside of my pastoring. I was also a corporate chaplain. And so one of the employees, the family member passed away and asked me to do the funeral. And so the funeral director there had told me, and I won't mention the denomination at all, but um, he sat down with me while I was just kind of putting last minute thoughts, in the side room there before everything began. And he sat down, wanted to have a conversation, and a super nice guy at first. And one of the funeral directors, and and he talked about the fact that he was a believer, and I said, well, that is great. I said, when did you come to Christ? And I'll never forget his response. The way it was, I thought, oh, okay, I get where he's coming from on this. I said, how did you come to Christ? I mean, when did he come into your life? How did you give your life over to him? And it's just this kind of strange, just really proud, but in the more negative way to me, in my impression of it, smile. And he just said, well, because I was chosen before the foundation of the world. And I said, okay, well, thank you. That's really good. And I really needed to move on with my notes. It wasn't going to, it was like he wanted to continue that discussion uh, in maybe in a debate like type way. And I'm like, man, we've got a funeral to do here, and you're the director. And but I just remember that. And I thought, there it is again. Instead of just saying, I realized I was a sinner, Christ died for me. And I bent the knee and submitted my will to him and, asked him to save me. It wasn't that, well, because I was chosen. It was just the chest just filled up with
Right,
air,
right.
and I was like, come on, just be real, man, So I've
Yeah,
run into that time and time again, but that was that stand that stood out to me and always will.
yeah. And of course, as you've mentioned, not all Calvinists exude that much of a sense of pride or arrogance. Many of them, in fact,
Absolutely.
have
Yeah.
called other Calvinists out and try to say that we should be the most humble of them all because and they try to point out that we were chosen unconditionally, and
Mhm.
so that should humble us.
Yeah.
And I understand that feeling. Having been a Calvinist, I understand the feeling, but I used to mistake that feeling as humility, like, oh, I'm humbled because God chose me. But I've learned that that's not humility. Um, some people say that, like, hey, the people chose me for this award that I received, at Oscars or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so humbled. That's not humility. Um, People think it's humility,
Yeah.
but that's a misnomer.
It's a
That's
misnomer. Yeah.
humility. Yeah, humility is when you're in your pigsty and you're at your bottom of your barrel and you're like, I can't do this anymore. It's the same word from humiliation. This concept where you're humiliated and your sin and your life and your deeds are just exposed and you fall on your face like the publican and say, woe is me, I can't even look up to you. That's humility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Humility is not this sense of, wow, I'm picked and I really don't deserve to be picked, but I
Yeah.
am picked. And he could
Yeah.
have just as easily chose somebody else except me. He could have even chose everybody, but he didn't. He chose me for no apparent reason. I mean, it could be a DNA thing. I mean, we don't know. He picked
Yeah.
me, and I don't know why he picked me. No, it's he chose me out of my pigsty. He chose me not without regard of the good and bad I did. He chose me in full view of all the bad I've done, and he still
Right.
chose to have mercy upon me, a sinner. That's when that true humility knocks you to your face. That's what it feels like, and I bought into that and mistakenly thought that kind of that feeling, euphoric
Mhm.
feeling that you have that God picked you before the foundation of the world was humility, and it wasn't until I found myself in the face of my own sin and pigsty that I realized, oh wait, that's a much different feeling, a
Yeah.
much different feeling than the one
Yeah.
I felt coming into Calvinism, and
Yeah.
people I think need to be uh, warned about that because if you're under the delusion that that is humility, then I think you're going to be shocked one day when you experience what true humility is.